Good morning. Welcome to session 2 of our user-friendly records management series. Today we shall be talking about planning and implementation strategies. My name is Rick Martin. I'm the practice lead for Habanero's Enterprise Content Management or Records Management practice. If you were with us 2 weeks ago, you would have heard myself and Graham Sibley, he's the CEO at Collabware, talking as well. Today, I'm afraid you just have me. Habanero and, by way of introduction, Habanero and Collabware, we've actually got a really long history of working together. It's one of the tightest partnerships that Habanero has. Habanero creates great workplace experiences through technology. For us, that means we deliver technology solutions that uplift people's workplace experiences. We've actually been working in this realm, this workplace experience realm, for many years, more so in an employee portal or an intranet sense. And it's been a really amazing journey taking this thinking and applying it into the records management space. Records management solutions have not always adequately enough addressed the experience of the end users. This has been to the detriment of the solution and the outcomes that we're trying to drive, but also, of course, to the end user. And our approach in this regard is proving really, really transformational. Collabware is a software firm. They're actually based up here in Canada. Their offices are very near ours. They create intelligent enterprise information management software. They really focus on creating software that is simple, seamless, and transparent. And it's this focus on simple, seamless, and transparent that we really appreciate with them. It's very similar to our own ethos around the user experience. This is our agenda today. We'll talk very briefly about user-friendly records management. Why do we need to care? I'll walk through our webinar series. We have, this is session 2 of a 5-part series. So I'll walk you through the remaining 3 and you can decide if you want to join them, if you want to have one of your colleagues join. And then we'll get into the main topic today, which is planning and implementation strategies. So why do we need to care about being user-friendly? It could be simply because people are starting to expect it. The quality of consumer-facing electronics and consumer-facing software through iPhones and iPads and the Android environment is just head and shoulders above, generally speaking, head and shoulders above what we're doing within the enterprise. And we believe that this is driving the agenda substantially. To be a bit more specific, within the enterprise, we believe that user experience can drive better adoption and drive better usage. 2 critical topics that almost always surface within a records management implementation. We think about adoption as getting people into the system, whereas usage is about manicuring the interactions within the system so that it gets used correctly. Poor classification accuracy, for example, I think is about weak usage rather than a lack of adoption. Secondly, the digital workplace that we operate in is now global. We talked about this last time. We talked about the lessons last time from General Electric. The CIO, Jim Fowler, he has actually mandated within the organization that they either embrace these alternate solutions, embrace these solutions in the global digital workplace, or they make it easier to use the tools that are sanctioned. It doesn't really make sense from a records management perspective to be embracing the solutions available in the global digital workplace. So we're left with the second option, making it easier to use the tools that are sanctioned. So when we think about that, that means that we have to present as compelling an experience to your users as the options that are out there. Could be Dropbox, could be OneDrive, could be Google Docs, could be anything, or even our old friend, email. Thirdly, why do we need to care? Because people's jobs have changed. People's jobs are not routine, mechanized, or mechanical tasks anymore. People's jobs are creative and collaborative. People are mobile. People won't necessarily permit the routine tasks that we require of them or we have previously required of them as we ask them to classify documents or to declare records. And then finally, experience really matters. I was chatting with a records manager from one of the Canadian law firms last week, and we started talking about the Uber taxi battle, I guess. And what we realized is that there's a lot of parallels between this and records management. The reason being that people are using Uber because it's convenient. The basic commodity is the same. You get from A and you go from A and you get to B. The commodity is the same, but the experience is what matters. What people like about Uber is things like, well, you can see the price prior to booking. You have the one-tap rides feature. You can follow the drivers on a map as they come and pick you up, and as you're, of course, within the Uber car itself. And you've got interesting things like fare splitting options. That stuff does not exist inside the world of a regular taxi. The disruption that this is creating is astounding. We have taxi drivers striking and blocking airports. But then on the other end of the spectrum, passengers are so frustrated and they're waiting for Uber to arrive within their city or within their town. It's tremendously interesting thinking about what's driving this. Really, when you boil it down, it's about the experience that's being delivered. So within the realms of records management, what actually is user-friendly records management? We believe it can be boiled down to four things. Firstly, focus on the end user's jobs. We're not trying to get our end users to be records managers. We actually want to support and enable them in doing their jobs. And we believe that if we do that, we earn the permission and the trust to deliver records management on the back end of that. Related to that, we want to isolate users from records management or records keeping activities. Thirdly, we want to reduce the barriers. There's lots of challenges even to get into the records management solution. We want to get rid of annoying VPN solutions or complex passwords or complex login screens. Of course, within the realms of what makes sense. But we have to think about this holistically as a solution, not just think about the experience of end users once they're into our system. And then finally, always evolve. We advocate an iterative approach to delivering records management. What that means is that you just keep on rolling through the organization, and as you do that, needs change, business requirements change, business imperatives change, and you have to keep on evolving. Just because you've delivered your records management solution does not mean the job is done. So where are we aiming in all of this? I showed this last time, and I think it's really valuable to show again. We're not talking about flying cars here. We're talking about delivering an experience that exists already in many other places within the technology environment. We're going through a path and a journey that is a very well-trodden path. We've been doing it with, as I say, with employee portals or intranets for a long, long time. External websites or customer portals, they've already addressed the challenges that we're trying to overcome here. So we're not pushing the boundaries. We're really just trying to take a bunch of thinking that's already been done and apply it into the records management space. Okay, so we'll talk briefly about our webinar series. So today, February 18th, we are talking about our planning and implementation strategies. In 2 weeks' time, we will be talking about building the foundation. And then 2 weeks after that, we will be covering off what we call bringing it to the business, which is really the rollout strategy. And then finally, on March 31st, seems like a long way away, we will be talking about considerations for post-go-live support and evolution. So enterprise planning and implementation strategies. Before we jump into this, we're going to just talk briefly about the goals. I think about the planning process, or any planning process really, as a period of course, preparation, but also of engagement and thinking before we get into the heart of the project. One of the things that we want to do when we get into the heart of the project, we want to be able to build some momentum. We don't want to get into the project, for example, and discover, oh, we don't have a common understanding of what a record is, or we don't have a common understanding of the file plan that we're going to be using. Lots of your users or lots of your even internal team will have different ideas around the solution that we're going to be implementing. Somebody once said to me that you can either plan and then execute a project, or you can execute the project and fail and then plan and then execute the project again. And that advice has always stuck with me. So the first goal is really to share knowledge. We find tremendous value in ahead of time getting our clients on the same page as us around the approach and the methodologies that we're going to be leveraging as we go through projects of this nature. It also helps to explain the rationale as to why we're doing each piece of the process. The second area that we're looking to share knowledge with our clients with is that and this is fairly self-evident, but the technical and the solution knowledge. In this case, we're talking about SharePoint and Collabware. You may have a different records management solution, but as you go through the process, this is an excellent opportunity to start to educate your users. If it's a new platform for them or a new platform for your company, it's a great opportunity to start to expose them to that solution. And then finally, we find it really valuable to share key learnings. And this is really actually bidirectional. This isn't necessarily us as records managers telling our clients or for you guys as records managers telling your internal teams how things roll. This is actually a bit more bidirectional than that. What you're looking to do is engage your stakeholders, understand what's worked within the organization, understand what hasn't worked, understand how people have approached big technology projects before, for example. The next goal for our planning process here is about engagement. When we talked about our vision and roadmap session 2 weeks ago, this is really very much about engagement and engaging your stakeholders. We talked about producing a roadmap. So we would really advocate getting that roadmap out, reviewing it with your stakeholders. As you get through your planning process, there's a bunch of workshops and so on involved that we'll walk through today. Get that roadmap out and start to use that as a communication tool. And then finally, this is maybe the most obvious piece of planning, the most obvious rationale for planning. We have to decide on governing principles here. We're not talking necessarily firm rules, thou shalt do this or thou shalt do that. I don't think that the records management domain is that black and white or cut and dried. I think really what we're looking to create is some governing principles upon which we ask our users and our teams to operate within. So now we're going to talk about the implementation strategies themselves. We call these the 5 pillars. The 5 implementation strategies are, firstly, applied records management. This is about the heart of the domain, the technical domain of records management. We call it applied records management. Secondly, we'll talk about migration, and then security and governance, and then finally, and last but not least in our mind, is the user experience. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process of these of each of these pillars. Generally speaking, the domain, these topics are fairly well understood, especially by the audience that we have today in our webinar. And what we want to do is really impart the value of the process that we're going to be walking through, and the technical bits and pieces and the topics that you'll be discussing in each one are probably fairly well known to you guys. We will get into some of them, but really we see a lot of value in the process itself. So each pillar has a workshop or two. Of course, there's decisions to make around the audience and the attendees. And then finally, as we're going through each of the 5 pillars, there are decisions being made and they need to be captured. So the workshops, we typically have 1 or 2 workshops per pillar. These workshops might be an hour, might be an hour and a half. It depends on the experience of the attendees and the audience that we're walking through. We'll of course, the initial plan is to spend some time educating all the attendees to get them up to the same level of understanding of the topics within that pillar. This is also a really great opportunity to surface issues, surface challenges that we might encounter through the project itself. And then what we really want to do at the end is discuss the key decisions and actually, of course, hopefully make key decisions through the process. And we're going to be walking through some of those decisions today. In terms of the audience, the audience for the 5 pillars process can be a bit political to figure out. We typically find that for the applied records management pillar, generally speaking, it's just records managers. As you get into the migration topic, this starts to open up to a slightly broader collection of stakeholders. So the records managers, again, IT are typically involved, or stakeholders at the table from a migration perspective. And then you start to think about the records management department champions, or the people who actually own the content. From a security perspective, you've got a similar looking audience. If security is a separate team to your IT team, you would of course want to include them. The governance pillar, again, records managers, IT, but then really you want to find the opportunity to talk to your project stakeholders. So this might be senior executives around governance within your records management initiative. The governance is what really makes a big difference in these implementations. And then finally, from a user experience perspective, the audience or the stakeholders that you really want to be able to address here, records managers, of course, you want to be talking to your project stakeholders, your business stakeholders, and then last and definitely, again, not least, you want to be talking to your users. Obviously, you don't want to talk to all of your users, but you want to have a good cross-section. You might have several different user experience workshops. And then finally, you have a decision log. This is very simple stuff. We're very pragmatic when it comes to these things. In this case, we just want to capture the decisions inside of an Excel spreadsheet like this. The decisions are very typically more of a narrative. They're not necessarily going to be black and white. Are we going to go with option A or option B? It's typically more nuanced than that. So there's often a narrative that you'll want to spend some time developing for each decision. So the first of the 5 pillars is applied records management. Some of this is going to be training on the solution, Collabware or SharePoint, and some of it will be more about discussion of core records management domain. There's 5 different topics within applied records management. What we're going to do is we dig into these. We're going to dig into the first 2, records lifecycle and file plan design, in a little bit more detail, and then we'll just briefly introduce the last 3. As we described at the beginning, each of these topics, each of these pillars is a 1 or 1.5 hour workshop. So we can't get into all of the pillars in tons and tons of detail today in this 1 hour webinar. So the first topic within applied records management, like I say, is the records lifecycle. This could be as simple as just getting everybody on the same page around what that lifecycle looks like within your organization. We find there's lots of different interpretations of the records lifecycle, and then really the application of that lifecycle into your technology stack. If you have record centers, if you have collaboration team sites, how do you apply or how do you move the documents or records through those different environments as they progress through their lifecycle? The second topic, file plan design, is really interesting. There's lots of different approaches for this, and this does actually influence or impact your end user experience as well. We'll get into that. The third topic here is just getting into a standard definition. In the same way that we need a standard definition of the record lifecycle, we simply need a standard definition for the records themselves. How do you define records? How do you define convenience files or transitory records or non-records? Even if your organization has a policy, you'll find there are different opinions of how to sort of interpret that policy. The next topic is document classification. This is really getting into the heart of the SharePoint or Collabware environment. For us, how this shows up will be discussions of things like content types, metadata, and term sets. These are all how you map the classification into the technology. There's considerations here around whether you use a more of a centralized approach or whether you use a decentralized approach. Who has access to control the basic definition of a content type or of various pieces of metadata, for example. And then the last topic here is email management. So the records lifecycle, I'm not going to describe a records lifecycle. You guys know what it is all about. The 2 pieces here, firstly, defining the lifecycle. Simply just draw it out and work with your stakeholders to make sure that everybody has a common understanding about what the lifecycle is for your particular records management strategy. And then once you've got that lifecycle, define where and how the documents or the records live within your technology stack. For example, you can see here from creation through active and semi-active, what we're saying here is that these records live in collaboration team sites. Once they are made inactive or they go into the disposition, then they live in a record center archive. It doesn't necessarily matter exactly where these files live or where this content lives, but there's a lot of value in just defining it and having everybody on the same page as to how the files move throughout the technology stack. The second topic here is the file plan design. There's lots and lots of different ways of doing this. And again, I don't think that this is necessarily saying anything that people haven't thought about here. One approach, for example, is to have the file plan designed by department. You can see you might have an area of the file plan for HR, an area of the file plan for finance, for operations, so on and so forth. Or then you might take a different slice through your organization and you define your file plan by business function. For example, this is the file plan for all of the HR functions within the organization. This is a file plan for all of the finance functions within the business, and so on and so forth. The final consideration for file plan design is the size of each classification category. This is the so-called big bucket versus small bucket discussion. The advantages of having bigger buckets are you reduce the risk of misfiling. You have to create bigger collections, bigger groupings of your content. So, for example, you might end up with content that has slightly different retention schedules living within one bucket, accepting, for example, that it's okay to keep some of the content, some of those records longer for the simplicity of having fewer content groupings. On the other hand, the small bucket scenario, it allows you to get much more specific and be really clear that you're deleting or disposing of content at exactly the right time. Like many topics we'll be discussing across the records management, this is really a discussion of organizational risk. So the next topic we want to talk to is migration. The most obvious question with migration is the scope. Exactly what are you going to migrate? You're going to migrate everything? You're going to migrate just bits of it? There's a lot of different, typically, lots of different repositories you can migrate from. Of course, file shares, everyone has them. You think about C drives, you think about Outlook and email, think about paper files, and then, of course, there's oftentimes a legacy ECM solution that you want to be migrating from. Other considerations here are what type of documents are you going to migrate? And even within that, are you going to migrate everything? Are you going to migrate the most current files? And so on. As you think about migrating things into a SharePoint environment, some other considerations are the file types. Generally speaking, SharePoint's very good at managing Office files, PDFs, that sort of thing. It's not necessarily quite so good at migrating electronic drawings or CAD files. There's also considerations around using special characters in file names. If your legacy system or your file sharing has some of those special characters, you need to figure out a strategy for dealing with those. Another consideration here is whether you clean up or organize documents ahead of moving them. And then finally, you've got to think about what to do with electronic stubs. So these are stubs that point to or reference records that exist in the physical world, paper, for example. In terms of different methods, fairly obvious. You can migrate things manually. Generally speaking, if you're migrating a small volume, manual migration process can work quite nicely. It's an opportunity. I would always push the migration process to your end users. It's an opportunity for your end users to start to use your new system, start to understand where their content, where their documents and records are going to live. It's only really useful if you're not migrating hundreds of thousands of files, of course. Your users aren't going to take that very kindly. The second method would be to script it. We often script big migrations through use of something like PowerShell. It's nice and controllable, it's nice and configurable, and it takes a bit more effort, but you can, once you've developed those scripts, you can run them over and over again and fine-tune them. And then finally, when you fine-tuned them enough, you can execute the final migration process, and then you'll be finished. And then, of course, there's a myriad of third-party tools out there that you could use as well. In terms of an approach, there's again lots of different options here. You don't necessarily need to migrate everything. Oftentimes, clients come to us and say, hey, we're going to implement a new system and we're going to have to migrate everything. There's sometimes been some commitments made around, hey, we're going to move everything from our old legacy system into our nice new shiny records management solution. It's worth digging into that and really trying to understand if that's really the best case. You can have multiple phases of migration. You can migrate things iteratively. It really depends on your timeline, on your project approach. You can focus on the high value or current information first and then revisit the rest of the documents and records in a future phase. And then if you're not going to migrate everything, the other thing to think about is what do you do with the content, the documents or records that you're leaving behind? It might be future phase, or you just leave them in place and deal with them in place for until the end of their days. I couldn't resist some sort of a continuum diagram here, migrating nothing at all to migrating everything. Typically, if you're going to migrate nothing or migrating very little, you can make it manual. As you move to migrating everything, you're typically looking at some sort of an automated solution if you have hundreds of thousands or millions of files, of course. Some of the considerations here, licensing is quite a popular rationale for wanting to migrate everything. If you wanted to retire licensing from a legacy ECM solution, then you might choose to migrate everything. If you want to just migrate the current files or the high-value files, then you might choose to migrate substantially less and leave the other files where they are today. You can also consider search as an appropriate solution when you're thinking about moving your migration. We'll talk about that in an example that we're going to walk through here. So the best practice. I hate to say it, but the best practice for us is to ask questions, explore commitments, and iterate towards a plan. The notion of a best practice in this world, or in this domain, like most domains, is quite challenging. We have never found a formulaic approach for migration, whether we're talking about records management, whether we're talking about an employee portal, or even an external website. You have to get in and understand the different facets of the decision. You have to understand what the stakeholders are looking for. You're probably looking at your vision and your roadmap document as well in order to understand the best possible approach. It's useful to talk about an example here. These migration conversations are often quite nuanced, and you'll be left, as you go into it, you'll be in a position that you feel, this has got to be, somebody else has got to have addressed these problems. They probably have addressed these problems, and unfortunately, there's no easy solution. So we had an example with a client. They came to us, they wanted us to build them a new solution, a new records management solution. They had a legacy records management solution, and they said to us, we'd just like you to migrate everything, please. As we got into the process, it turned out that they had very, very poor classification of within their existing legacy RM solution. The classification accuracy was less than 30%. The big challenge, of course, here is that we're going to be disposing of, with a classification accuracy that weak, we're going to be disposing of files we should be retaining and retaining files that should be in disposition. So thinking about that challenge, migrating everything to a new solution is really probably just sullying our new shiny records management solution. So the approach that we took was we decided that we wanted to keep our new solution with a nice clean classification, of course. What we decided to do was migrate only select content. Upon further analyzing the classification and the content within that legacy solution, we found that there were actually pockets of records that were actually quite accurately classified. And so with a little bit of cleanup in those small areas, we were able to take those and migrate them into the new environment. The question remains, well, what do we do with the documents or the content, the records that we're leaving behind? And what we did here was we implemented search. And typically speaking, we would always implement search within our solutions, of course. But in this case, we implemented search pointing back to the original legacy solution as well, so that users are always able to find those records, whether or not they have been migrated or whether they're living in that original legacy solution. Of course, this approach does mean that the organization is committed to maintaining that legacy solution going forwards. The challenge here is either you maintain that legacy solution going forwards, or you have to spend the time, energy, and resources in cleaning up all of your content. Okay, so our third pillar is security. Enterprise content management is about making the right information available to the right people at the right time. This is as much about keeping information secure or dispositioning it at the right time as it is about keeping information accessible or really retaining it for the right amount of time. And when you think about it like this, security, of course, is a key piece of doing this correctly. Firstly, think about your security approach. This is really dependent upon your organization's culture regarding information sharing. And when security is left more open, it's easier to manage, it ensures findability, discoverability, and it improves reuse of information. We really do find that this differs substantially across our clients. Some clients are much more culturally locked down. It's not even necessarily based on the type of industry, but it's really based on culture. So some organizations are much more locked down, much more siloed. Some organizations are just inherently more open and have a greater level of sharing internally. Not to say one is better than the other, but you have to really understand and assess your organization's culture. And then, regardless of that culture, you will probably discover there are different areas with a different level of security requirement. You might have confidential or sensitive information that just need much more restrictive access. So be aware of that. That's really going to be part of your governance structure. As you think about this and and apply it to the technology itself, one of the big challenges that you will encounter is whether you use Active Directory groups or whether you use SharePoint groups to manage your security. And you can actually use a combination of the two. It's a much bigger discussion than we have time for today, but really just to put it on your radar, there's a couple of different approaches here. So it's also quite common to have different security applied to different stages of the record lifecycle. So you can see here we might have a different set of security for the collaboration team sites than we do for the Record Center archive, for example. And as we've discussed, what you want to think about in each scenario is who can see what, and then who can control who can see what. Okay, our next pillar is governance. So governance is a bit of an interesting topic. It can be a bit overwhelming. There's a lot of content, a lot of material around governance. I think of it simply as a system by which, in this case, your ECM solution is managed and controlled. Really, it boils down to a series of conversations or discussions with all of your various stakeholders to figure out who is going to do what within the really broad spectrum of governance. You can have governance at the sort of strategic level, of course, in terms of, okay, what are we going to do and where are we going to go, down to the governance of day-to-day operations in terms of backup strategies or enforcement or monitoring activities or what have you. In terms of what it'll do for you, I often think of a few different things. Firstly, it'll allow you to maintain some consistency across your solution within the areas that you're looking for. And we've talked about how we don't want to necessarily lock the whole thing down and have it completely rigid, but we need a certain level of consistency. The next outcome from governance is it allows you to identify your resources. And this isn't just people, but this might be resources like time and money as well. with a proper governance strategy, you're able to justify and communicate the business outcomes and make sure that the resources you're putting into your solution are commensurate with those outcomes. To that point, it really does allow you to make sure that you're delivering the value that you have promised or that you have committed to or that other people have committed to. And then finally, and this is probably one of the most compelling pieces, it increases your solution longevity. Governance through the project process, the initial build of your records management or your ECM solution it's obviously necessary, I guess. You have a project, you have a project manager, you have a project sponsor, you have project team members, and so on and so forth. Governance in that context is self-evident. The challenge where governance often breaks down, or where governance often breaks down, is after the fact, when the solution is quote-unquote finished. I don't believe that the project is finished when your solution is complete. The project is only really getting started at that point, and that's really where the value of good governance kicks in, to make sure that you start to get into regular rhythms and regular routines around the solution, and make sure that the solution stays current and vital for a longer time. When you think about governance, you can think about governance as really it should be more of a philosophy of guiding your end users. Occasionally you will have to use it as a monitoring and even potentially a controlling tool, but we always find that we aim to guide our users through governance mechanisms rather than anything else. There's a collection of different areas for governance, as I've mentioned. We've got the top level strategic governance. Next down we have operational governance, systems governance, content governance, and then the last band is governance around support, education, and evangelism. So in terms of the governance approach, we find that it's best to just have a workshop like all of the other pillars, and you work with your stakeholders in reviewing the governance model. The first thing to do is just to get everybody on the same page around the topic of governance, help them understand what it's for. And then really you just need to work through that RACI matrix. You'll find that you have to get really specific. The specificity with which you break down the tasks and the conversations and the decisions will really help. It allows people to really understand what you're talking about. You might identify the nuts and bolts of individual tasks, then you can roll those up into slightly broader categories for the purposes of your RACI matrix. I always think about governance as sort of a steamroller. You'll go through, you'll make a bunch of decisions around tasks and responsibilities and roles and so on and so forth. And then you've sort of got to go forwards and backwards and forwards over it in order to sort of smooth everything out. It's not necessarily going to be a one-time thing. Don't expect that you'll necessarily nail it in one session. It might take 2 or 3 sessions to really boil it down and be really satisfied with it. When you're done, you will probably end up with something like this, a RACI matrix or a responsibility chart. You have the responsibility down the left-hand side, and you can make this quite specific, and then you have the party responsible on the right-hand side, and you can actually have individuals in this chart, not just necessarily roles. These are some of the governance topics that we see that we have to address inside of SharePoint. Site creation, retention, and deletion. This is a really interesting one. Do you decide, for example, that end users can decide that they want to provision and create their own team site and then subsequently delete it? That might be appropriate, it may not be appropriate. You have to decide the ownership for enterprise level term sets within SharePoint. And then there's other things, who's managing and who's dictating the policies and who's communicating those policies. Support model, of course, what's your support organization going to look like? We're going to talk more about that in the last of our webinar series here in the post go live. And then finally, the last topic here is measurement. Measurements are actually a really, really useful tool when it comes to governance. We're going to just dig into that just for a minute or two here. So this is our measurement framework. You read this from left to right. We actually find there's 2 pieces to measurement. We'll get to the second piece. So as we go from left to right, the items on the right-hand side are much harder to measure, but they're closer to the outcomes that we, or actually our business stakeholders, care about. So that the initial areas that you can measure, these aren't all that interesting or all that relevant measurements oftentimes. Could be simply the number of records viewed, the number of records created, the number of user visits, and so on and so forth. It's really based around usage. The next category of measurement is really around events. The number of files disposed, the number of holds, the amount of search feedback, number of potential records, so on and so forth. In this category, we're getting a little bit closer. The information we're getting is a little bit higher value than simply usage stats, but we're still not really identifying really valuable measures. The final category is what we call experiences. And this is really starting to get into interesting measurements that we can take back to our business stakeholders and that they will hopefully care about. Measures in this group are, for example, completing a business process, maybe sharing some knowledge or executing a checklist. These are things that en masse, if we aggregate all of these experiences, we can go back and say that, yes, we're doing a good job, or maybe even, no, we're not yet doing a good job and we need to push further in this particular measurement.
Okay, so our next pillar, our last pillar actually, is user experience. So user-friendly records management, as we've discussed, is about focusing on helping the end user perform their jobs. In order to do this, they have to be able to locate the information that they use on a regular basis, or even, of course, on an irregular basis. We've discussed a few different approaches to this user experience already, but I'm just going to reiterate this. We like to think of this as a few different levels. Of course, we have a model. So the first level, and this, what we find is this is typically where most records management solutions are at. User experience considerations are somewhat restricted because of technology or because of the team experience or because of funding or what have you. To the user experience considerations are restricted to trying to make the solution comprehensible to the end user. So really what we're thinking about here is bringing users into the records management world. Another approach, maybe more advanced from a user experience perspective, is the solution is focused on thinking about the users' jobs and their interactions with the systems. So we're thinking about bringing records management into the user's world. The final level here is experience design, where the project is focused on thinking about the end user's jobs and their interactions with the world sort of outside of the system. So really we're thinking about the broader end user's experience of performing their jobs. This is best sort of highlighted with a bit of a story. So we're working with an insurance company, and we were trying to assist their front desk agents. So the bit of background here is that those agents would be meeting with their customers and trying to work out the best insurance for those customers, or trying to resolve their issues or their concerns. The environment here is a really critical piece of the puzzle. So the agents would be working at their front desk as customers would walk into the building, and then for some of the more detailed or longer conversations, they'd go and find a small meeting room to talk to the customer. The one interesting challenge, so as they would go into the small meeting room, obviously they would be interacting with the customer and using a different computer. They didn't have any laptops. One issue that they faced was that their content was all in online resources, and it was somewhat hard to locate within their system that they were using at the time. It was often detailed policy information and so on and so forth. So because of the challenge with locating this information, the agents would typically prepare and locate all of these resources in advance. Of course, absolutely makes sense. The challenge was when they would have to go into a small meeting room. They've prepared all these online resources on their normal computer, but they would have to be accessing these resources from within this small meeting room. So what we discovered they were doing was they were writing out these really long, and this is somewhat this is my representation of these URLs. They would be writing out these long, complex URLs so they could take them into the meeting room. So of course, they then take them into the meeting room, and then they'd have to retype them into the browser in the computer in this small meeting room. So obviously it's a bit of a process issue here. Once we understood what were occurring, we were actually able, what was occurring, we were able to adjust the solution to cater to the fact that they need a way to somehow save or store these URLs, even temporarily. The interesting thing here and the takeaway here is that this was a realization that we wouldn't have ever come across if we weren't thinking about these users in the broader context of how the solution we're building is supporting them in doing their jobs. What we ended up implementing for these guys was a My Links area. It was very simple, actually. We implemented a My Links area within the solution, and it was sort of tied to each user profile. So as they would log in one PC or another PC, that My Links area would follow them from PC to PC. Very, very simple solution. But again, it's the experience and the consideration of the experience that they were having in performing their jobs, which allowed us to understand the exact best solution for these guys. So it might be that this third tier sounds a little bit like flying cars. I mean, this My Links isn't exactly revolutionary, but understanding and going through the concept of experience design is maybe a little bit further than most people are going through, or a little bit further than most people are pushing this domain right now. But we do think that this will be where the industry is going to move. Think again about the Uber and those taxi drivers. It's really about the experience. So today, as we get into the user experience, and we're going to focus on actually what that second tier looks like. So when you start to encounter the topic of user experience, it will take you probably 3 seconds to come across the term information architecture. So information architecture, it's very simple. It's just the user experience word for taxonomy. And obviously taxonomy is well known to us in the records management domain. There's a slight twist on this taxonomy. This is a taxonomy from the perspective of an end user, or at least it should be from the perspective of an end user. So just to expand this point, we have a file plan. Obviously that's just a records management taxonomy. And then an information architecture is another form of taxonomy, albeit from the end user perspective. Another way of thinking about information architecture is that it's a site structure. So you can see here we have a site structure diagram. This is slightly fictitious, but you could see within Habanero we have department breakdown, sales, marketing, delivery, projects, finance, so on and so forth. So there's a few different important differences between an information architecture and a file plan. So the information architecture might change more often than a file plan. Imagine if there's a reorg, for example, or a new department or a new team, then of course that information architecture would change. Whereas a file plan is much, much less likely to change. So another thing about information architecture is consider this information architecture we're looking at right now. We're organized by function. So think about where the content that relates to one specific project might exist. Let's use the example of a construction project, for example. So there would probably be some content in the projects area. There might be some outstanding accounts payable for that project, or maybe accounts receivable. There might be some SR&ED documentation for that project, and there might be maybe some delivery documentation for that project. This is okay in some senses, but information for one project here really is distributed across many different areas of the structure. This can make it hard to get a full perspective on the project and lead to the development of silos within an organization. In some cases, and I think specifically in an organization that is focused around projects, it can make sense to organize your information architecture around those projects instead. So you can see here, in this case, you can see below the projects category, we have a number of different projects: ECM project, ERP project, marketing, and construction project, a nebulous generic construction project. And then below each of the projects, we can have different categories, whether they're documents or document libraries, or even they might be team sites. I think about this approach as more of an entity-centric approach to information architecture, rather than an org chart or functional approach to information architecture. There are pros and cons, but it's worth just putting it out there to expose that to you guys. So as you will likely have understood by now, the file plan approach and structure does not match with the information architecture approach, regardless of how you structure your information architecture. Just think about this sample file plan. Firstly, it's by function, and then secondly, it's alphabetical. And then the secondary category is by file type, policy and procedures, general, subject files, so on and so forth. Switching this up for an information architecture, we have two sample IAs, but they're fairly representative of an information architecture. One is by department and one is by function. You can see here that the secondary level would be a further classification by category, not by file type, which is what we had with the file plan. For example, for the hiring, we have resumes, interview notes, and then maybe an employment contract. Not to get into the details of the nuts and bolts of the information architecture here, it's really evident that these two taxonomical approaches, a file plan and an information architecture, aren't going to match. And this is an interesting piece. So you end up with a mechanism here where you have information architecture and you have to map that into your file plan. And this is a core piece of a records management solution. So this is going to be a many-to-one mapping. Many different areas of information architecture will map into one record category within your file plan. It's worth pointing out here, from an electronic sense, of course, it's tempting to think about the records as moving into the file plan, and in the physical records management world, that notion made sense. But in an electronic sense, it's more useful to think of a file plan as being, of course, a collection of policies that are associated with each area of the information architecture. So we've mentioned that information architecture is the user's perspective of the contents of the solution. It's worth pointing out that ultimately this ends being mapped into the structure of SharePoint and then finally Collabware. The IA gets built out as site collections, team sites, document libraries, and views. And here's a really simple example of a piece of an IA hierarchy being mapped onto a team site page itself. So that was a bit of a journey into information architecture. How does this actually benefit the users? From a user experience from the user experience perspective, a key question is how we help users in discovering content. It's fairly well known that there are two different approaches. Some users browse for content. They use a taxonomy to keep it manageable. In this case, that would be an information architecture. And other users just search. They just search for stuff. No taxonomy is needed. They just jump into the search bar, top right, typically type in whatever they're going to be looking for. Habanero has done lots and lots of usability testing, and we see these two traits living really side by side. Some people are browsers, some people are searchers. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just different ways of accessing information. So this is an example of a really fleshed out information architecture. There's actually two information architectures on this page. The first one is that navigation bar along the top. We've got how do I, resources, career essentials, teams and projects, and so on. The second information architecture is as a page itself. This is an information architecture for the top level of the team site we have here. So we have latest news, upcoming events, featured photos, poll, and so on. By contrast, this is a search environment. We've got no explicit information architecture, or very negligible information architecture. We just have project directory and how do I along the top here. Not really all that valuable for navigating. In this case, the navigation is really done, or the searching and finding content is really done through this search bar. So the user first searches for their content, and then they can use the refiners. These are the lists down the left-hand side. You can see result type, Excel, PDF, PowerPoint, and so on and so forth. They use the refiners to further navigate or exclude options. So for example, if you know you're looking for a PowerPoint file or a document produced by a certain person, you can enter your search term and then you can jump to that particular author, for example. You can extend this idea more of an organizational perspective, and you can have refiners based on department or based on function, based on location or site type, etc., etc. At the end of the day, the SharePoint environment is fairly configurable in terms of the main body of the search and the left-hand side refiners. So as a summary of browse versus search, here are some pros and cons. There's a few interesting nuances in here. So browse, the main advantage is that it readily allows discovery, which if your domain of content is you want to make it really discoverable. You want to allow people to find new bodies of information within your organization. That will make a ton of sense. From a drawback perspective for Browse, it is more effort to build. You need to develop this taxonomy. And really, from an end user perspective, it can be slower to use because you have to potentially click a couple of times to get to where you're going. On the other side, search, the main advantage of search is it's really quick. You can type in your search result, you can maybe use a refiner, and then, hey presto, you get to where you're going. From a downside perspective, your ability to discover within a search context is much limited. It would be like, of course, trying to Google something that you don't know the word for. That just wouldn't make any sense. You wouldn't be able to find stuff that you don't know about. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. We're right about the right time here. Just as a quick summary, we talked about our 5 pillars. The first one, applied records management. The second one, migration, security, governance, and then finally, user experience. We believe that all of these 5 pillars are really important to consider as you start to plan and develop implementation strategies for your records management solution.